Yeah, we're live. It's 7 o'clock, 7:01 on the dot. Tonight we're talking about, I'm getting ready to load. I was going to load this right before, but I thought it wasn't going to finish up before I had time to start the live feed. So I have a video that's ready to go up and where we're testing different intake manifolds on 5-liter Ford applications. Because the question always comes up invariably, how much is an intake manifold worth? And the answer, as we all know, is it depends. And here's the thing with the guys that are looking for and I almost entitled this dinos are dumb or something like that, because here's what people want. They want absolutes. So when we do a test on something, they want to know, okay, how much is this worth? Well, how much is this cam worth? How much are these cylinder heads worth? How much is this intake manifold worth? But the thing is, as I'm going to show you in this video where we tested intake manifolds on 3 different 5-liter Ford combinations, the gains that you get from an intake manifold are going to vary depending on, first of all, what intake manifold you're comparing it to. So if we're comparing a factory HO intake to a GT40, or a factory HO intake compared to an RPM2, or a GT40 compared to a ported System X, or whatever we're comparing, the two that you're comparing are obviously going to help determine how much power gain the intake manifold is worth. So the other thing that determines that is the motor that you're testing it on. If we test it on a bone stock 302, the gains that you get from an intake manifold upgrade, say going from a 5-liter HO up and lower to a GT40, you're not going to get that much power. And not because the GT40 won't support a lot more power. It will. We know that it'll support a tremendous amount more than the test that we showed. But the rest of the motor didn't have it wasn't taking advantage of what that intake manifold actually had to offer. And that's the thing that a lot of guys don't realize. They want to say, for instance, when I show a test where we picked up 60, 70, 80 horsepower from an intake manifold, which I did, they want that to be the case always. They think that number, whatever that number is, 60, 70, 80 horsepower, they think that that's an absolute. So that they think if that was worth that much power, if I go buy that intake, I'm going to get that much power on my combination, regardless of what my combination is. That's why I'm saying dinos are silly, because they're going to blame something else. They're going to say, well, it was worth that much power. It is on the right application. Just like when I tested, when I did cylinder head comparisons on a 392 Ford. Well, we were actually able to make a really big number with stock heads on a 392 or 393 stroker. We were up quite a bit over 2 horsepower per CFM with a stock head, which is a really big number. But it's just because we had so much draw, the big stroker had so much draw on those stock heads that, you know, it allowed us to make a really good specific output number using that head flow. It all the intake or the motor that you're testing, whatever combination you're testing, an intake manifold, cylinder head, camshaft, carburetor, whatever it is, plays a big part in determining what kind of power gains you're going to get from that combination. Then when we add boost on top of that, it gets even more difficult. A lot of guys think, and it doesn't matter whether the video that I'm putting up is on 5-liter Fords, but it carries over to anything, big blocks, small blocks, Ford, Chevys, Dodges, imports, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. A lot of people think that the gains that you get from, in this case, an intake manifold, that doesn't matter anymore when you add boost to it. So if we have a 5-liter HO intake manifold and we go to a GT40 intake manifold and we pick up 10, 20, 30 horsepower, whatever the number is, depending on the combination, and we add boost to it, well, now the HO intake manifold is no longer in the way. And here's where that comes from. Here's where that logic comes from. It comes from they're thinking of the intake manifold as more of a air source, like a throttle body. On a throttle body, if you blow through the throttle body, you increase the flow rate dramatically of the throttle body. It's a simple, airflow device. It's a simple blade. It opens up. And if you have a 65-liter throttle body, very common size on a 5-liter Ford, you can make a certain amount of power NA before that throttle body becomes a restriction. When we blow through that, if we had a turbo or twin turbos or a supercharger blowing through that, you can make a ton of power with a 65-millimeter throttle body. It no longer becomes a restriction to airflow. It does at some point, but that point is way out there. And you don't have to worry about that once you add boost to that equation. But doing that with the throttle body is different than doing that with the intake manifold. because the intake manifold doesn't work the same way that the throttle body does. The intake manifold isn't just about flow. It's about reflected wave. It's about runner lengths. It's about effective operating range for the manifold, like we will show you in this video. Even something as simple as a GT40 upgrade makes power at a different RPM range than the factory HO manifold does. The factory HO manifold was designed it's designed with really long runners. They don't flow tremendously well. It doesn't have a big throttle opening. It was designed for the factory application to make power where the factory wanted it to make power, and to work well in conjunction with the factory cam timing and that factory E7TE head and the factory exhaust and all of that stuff. So when you upgrade to a different intake manifold, it can dramatically change where the motor makes power. And we saw this was even more prevalent on the other tests, where we added significantly different intake manifolds. One was the RPM2 from Edelbrock, and the other one was a ported Holley Systemax intake manifolds, which were dramatically different than the intakes that we were starting with. So they had a sizable effect, kind of like testing, comparing a dual plane carbureted intake to a single plane intake. You can have a dramatic effect in power there. And the thing is that, and the path that I was going down here when I first started talking about boost, is when we do that kind of change, when we put on an RPM2 or a Holley Systemax compared to the factory HO, and we have this motor boosted, it's still going to like those power gains that you got from the intake, and it's still going to want to make power in the RPM range of the new intake manifold. Basically, the factory HO manifold, in the case of the 5-liter Mustang, is still going to be in the way. It's still going to be limiting power. It's certainly going to be limiting RPM potential of the combination, which is why, and one of the points that I made in the video is, when we do an intake manifold test on a combination that already has a cylinder head and camshaft combination that want to optimize power production in a given range, and then all of a sudden you add the intake manifold to the equation, making the big three, when you add that to it, and now all of them want to make power in the same RPM range, you're going to get pretty significant power gains, especially when you are restricting it with a factory HO intake manifold. So the intake manifold on a 5-liter Mustang, on a 351, on a 400, a 427, on a Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Honda, whatever it is, it's one of the key players. It's one of the big three in making power, and not only the amount of power that you make, but also where you make it in the RPM range. It works with the camshaft and the head flow. And obviously we've gone into time and time again when we're adding boost to it, which is why a centrifugal supercharger with a rising boost curve also wants to push power out higher in the RPM range. All of a sudden your HO manifold, your 5-liter, is going to make peak power at a higher engine speed, not because we've changed the resonance frequency of the intake or the reflected waves where they're going to be effective, but now you have an increasing amount of airflow going into the motor, an increasing amount of boost pressure, and so it will affect where this thing, or when this thing, what RPM this thing wants to make peak power at. So it's all really pretty cool stuff, and it's one of my favorite things. Forced induction and induction are two of my favorite things to test with. Going way back to early on when I first started doing all this. I have a 5-liter Mustang, which I still have, and I loved being on the dyno. I mean, my first experience with a chassis dyno was up in LA, and it was a chassis dyno where we had to sit in the back. We threw a bunch of sandbags and stuff in the back. We also sat we had the trunk open because this was a notch, and we sat in there to get the thing to plant the tires. And then while they were making runs, they had to take the readings at certain RPM. So it was quite a procedure. I had no idea how involved it was, and also how maybe not so repeatable that combination was back then. Now, obviously, when we went to the dyno jets, life got much better, and the Superflows and all the different chassis dynos now are much better than us trying to get data from that. Because I was trying to do, back then, I was trying to test an adjustable intake manifold that I had done. And it was hard to get just repeatable back-to-back data when we were doing this. But that's your first adventure. And then my first adventure on an engine dyno with the 5-liter Ford, I think, was actually with the guys up at R&E Racing up in Lancaster. And so if you guys are listening, thank you very much. That was an awesome experience. And running it with Powerdyne superchargers and Vortex superchargers and all kinds of cool stuff, it was an eye-opening experience. I think we managed to make over 600 horsepower with that. I think we had maybe a B trim, and then we had the Powerdyne. And we may have had an R trim back then, but I don't remember turning that thing up very much if we did. But it was all, it's all interesting stuff. I loved being on the dyno and the thing is, when you're new to it and you've just started, you start testing and you're like, oh, now I want to know this, and now I want to know this, and now I want to know this. So all it does is bring up the opportunity for more and more questions, which is why, I constantly frustrated the guys at West when early on, when I was just like, okay, but now we got to test this. Now we got to test this. They're like, dude, it's the end of the day. We have to stop doing this and this and this. So that's all, I get excited when we're talking about dyno stuff. So let me see what you guys are doing. Let me know what you think about intake manifolds and boost and intake manifolds in general, because I think that they're, I really like talking to people about the long runner, short runner stuff, and the reflected waves and Helmholtz resonance and inertial RAM and all the cool stuff that goes along with intake manifolds. So what do we got going on here from you guys? Let's get back and see some questions here. Let's see. The 86 EFI, I think, is the same, Tim, as the other ones. Tim, I do have some small block Ford stuff available. Mopar Knight, hey Lunar Outlaw, did you see Tony talking trash about you today? He lied about the 318 build. He's now claiming the block was yours. He watched yeah, he kind of threw that deal under the bus, and then also called out the guys. I'm sure it's Dulcich and Freiberger were saying things, I think, about Uncle Tony too, and now he's proposing some sort of, I have a motor over here, and we have to run it with a 2-barrel and all the stuff that came in the motor, and then you get a different motor over there, and we're going to run it on 2 different dynos, and that's not really a competition, and it's coming from a guy who doesn't spend very much time on the dyno and understand what a real comparison would be, a back-to-back test. Those motors, you have to start with the same motors, and then you have to do whatever things that you want to do to try to compare them. They have to be run on the same day at the same dyno by the same person, the same air fuel, same timing, all of that stuff to make sure that they're right. This way you're just that's just silly. You can't have a comparison run on different dynos on different days with different people, and none of that's really very good. And I think all this came about when those guys were talking about the flipping the piston thing, which he seems a little bit sensitive about. I want to test it because, like I said, I don't care whether it works or not. I just want to find out. I hope it does. I hope it shows power, but I want to, being a dyno guy, I want actual proof of that. Somebody telling me that doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't make any difference who it is. If John Causey came and told me something does something, I'd still want to test it. So it doesn't matter that Uncle Tony says he does this all the time, because when somebody says they do something all the time, that doesn't necessarily make it right. And what I want is the data to back that up. If he said, yeah, I run this all the time because in the 4 or 5 times that I've tested it, it's always done this and this and this and this, and he has all the data to back it up, I'd like, dude, that's awesome. That's fantastic. But when you say I do this all the time and it always works, but yet you don't have any data to back up whether it works or not, that's just not the same thing as data. That's actually an opinion, and that's a different thing. And that's all good, but and like I said, maybe it does work, and I hope that it does, but I'm definitely going to test that. Explorer intake is a good upgrade for the T-Bird. Yes, the Explorer intake is good, just like the GT40 stuff. Tennessee's in the house. How much spray can a stock 80s small 350 take? Probably a lot. Where they run into problems is not braking. They run into problems, actually, if you have the tune right, they run into problems processing that much nitrous. So we've run, like on an LS, we've run 300 shots on motors that we just pulled out of the junkyard. You normally can't do that on a 80s smog era 350 or a 351 or a 302. Only because they don't make enough power NA to add a whole bunch of power stock. Like when we run a 5.3 liter, If we run, excuse me, if we run a bone stock one, it makes 355 horsepower or so. Then you can add a fair bit of nitrous to that. If you run one with a cam in it, which I think we did, I think we actually put cams in them so that they would make more power. And then we ran 300 shots on them. So if you run with a cam and you're making 400 horsepower, 450 horsepower, whatever the number is, then you can add more power, so or more nitrous. So the more power the motor makes NA, the easier it is to add nitrous. If you have a 200 or 220 horsepower or 30 horsepower motor, you can't add very much nitrous because it just won't process that. It'll just all get stuck in there. Wisconsin's in the house. Still waiting for the 292, 455, 429, slant 6. Yeah, the 429 is not on that list. It will be, but the other ones definitely need to happen. Aussie's here as always. I like that. ProCharge Mopar's in the house. I use the BBK Box R on my 93. TFS made the Box R. Does BBK also make something that's called that? Philip, frying up the steak in some butter. There's nothing, the only thing better than steak is when you cook it with butter. Julius, yeah, 2002, I don't know. They would have stopped it in the Explorer, I think, would have been the last application for that. Would a 112 on an 8,000 RPM symbolic power be more usable than a 108 or 110 from gear to gear full throttle, 30-inch headers? You have way more to deal with than just the LSA. The LSA by itself isn't going to determine whether that cam works at 8,000 RPM. Almost Racing. Richard, I just scored a 544 valve from the junkyard for 250. That's a good deal. Those can make good power. Oh, Jody's saying 01 was the last year. Mario says, and this is good information for all of you guys can chime in. Mario says, I've never pulled a motor from the junkyard. How will my first time go? Well, it'll probably, if it's anything like mine, it will go where you have to take several trips to go get the right tools to get everything that you need, because you didn't bring all the tools that you need because there are other things in the way. And, oh, I don't have this short screwdriver that I needed to fit in there, because working on an engine on the dyno is really easy, but working on one in the car, getting to stuff and, you know, bring a knife and cutters and bring a hacksaw and bring impacts. And some guys are really serious about what they do, and they're very, very fast on getting motors out, which I like, because I often pay those guys to help get the stuff out. Greetings, Montana's in the house. I like that. Julius, I have seen and the call out's not to me. The call out is to, I think, to Freiberger and Dulcich. And I honestly don't think Dulcich or Uncle Tony wants to go head to head on a Mopar build with Dulcich, especially considering what I saw him do on the last one. Dulcich is a pretty good engine guy, and he's a pretty good Mopar guy. So that's just not something. Tony just thinks, I think, that he thinks that by turning the pistons around, that if the other guys don't do those things, that he's going to win that competition, because he has tricks that can make these things work better than other guys. What he doesn't realize is there's lots of really, really bright guys out in the world. Lots of guys have done all of the things that he's done and more, because he doesn't spend any time on the dyno. So guessing what works and knowing what works are different things. And Dulcich is pretty sharp. French Onion thinks that all Aussies are like Steve Irwin. I just watched Crocodile Dundee the other day, and I don't think everybody in Australia is like Paul Hogan. The BXR intake, I think we did run that way back. I think we did run it once. Is that the Cross Ram one where we had to have an offset distributor or something on it? Even it might have been a cog belt drive distributor or something that we needed to run that. LS Swap the World just ordered a Texas Speed Stage 2 truck cam. That should work good. The 212, 218, 550 lift. That should be good for a daily. Jason's Garage 5.3 LS truck manifold versus car manifold. Well, if you're comparing it to the, are you comparing intake manifolds or exhaust manifolds? If it's intake manifolds, the only car manifold that will be better than that truck manifold would be an LS6. The LS1 is terrible. The LS2 is okay, but your truck manifold's good. What you should get is a later truck one, like a Trailblazer SS or a late model Cathedral Port one, and that's a really good one. Have you ever done a dual carb tunnel ram on a 302? Yes, we have. I've run the Y-end tunnel ram on there. Tim is thinking Tony belongs at Hogwarts, apparently. What's that? 120? Oh, I'm showing 168 and 43, Mike. So 120 and 31 is still not great, right? Dennis has an LS1 intake and throttle body on a 5.7 with an LS9 cam. Any recommendations? You should add boost, or there are actually a lot better cam choices. That LS9 cam makes pretty good power on the top. Don't get me wrong. It comes alive. It just loses power down low and in the middle. We need a quad 4-barrel, so you gotta have 4 of them. Cross ram intake on a 600 plus cubic inch big block. So you just want all the carburetor on there. You're testing the wrong 5-liter Ford. I know Coyote stuff is good. It's impressive. I've tested Coyote stuff and it makes really good power. Yeah, Julie says Tony's a good guy, just set in his ways. There's nothing wrong with that, and I agree. Like I said, I was on for hours with Tony, and I like Tony. He seemed like a good guy. My only point was that I wanted to test it, and that's all. And I'm sticking with that. That's all I want to do is test it and see what it does. So he would be happy if I tested it and it showed that it made power. Then he could say, "Hey, look, this is certified by Richard Holder," like that means anything. But if it does make power, then that would put the whole thing to rest. I mean, a simple dyno test is all that it takes to find out what works. It's just a little bit of work to make it happen, but it's not that big a deal. Matt, we have run centrifugal superchargers on a carb stall EFI single plane. It would be the same. It does the same thing as a blow-through carburetor as it does if we have port injection on the single plane. The single plane acts like the single plane. It always does that. And then the long runner, System X or RPM2 do something different. Single plane carbureted intake manifold might make more power than those do, but it will be above 6,000. When is the latest LS head video coming out? What LS head video are you talking about? Kevin, I'm not familiar with that. Kevin's saying that I've read that you want your intake to outflow your heads by a certain percentage CFM to get max horsepower. I wonder what your thoughts are on intake and head CFM. I know a lot of guys that get solely focused on flow, flow the head, flow the intake manifold separately, then flow them together, and then try to work out ways to improve the combined flow. In my opinion, most of those guys don't look at like what the intake does. They're not looking at everything that the intake does. They're looking at how much the intake flows. And it's easy. And I always use the example of a long runner and short runner EFI manifold. It's possible that the long run or that the short runner manifold outflows the long runner manifold, except it loses power up to 6,000, or in the case of an LS3 manifold, even above that, maybe even up to 6,500. So making it flow more is a lot of times not the answer. Jason's Garage saying he had an Offenhauser 360 on a 302. I honestly don't remember running an Offie on one of those. JVV does more flow through heads on a flow bench always mean more power? No, it means more potential power. But there's a lot of things that go into making power. Jody, just do a search for Uncle Tony. His stuff on YouTube will come up. I got a question. How did Chevrolet make the wonderful sound of the 210 Corvette ZR1 LS7? Was that the... So if it's an LS7, that's a 500 horsepower NA motor. It has a good camshaft in it. It has really good cylinder heads. It has a decent intake manifold on it. There are obviously room for improvements in that. And then they worked on the exhaust system so it had the right sound. And it's running a fair amount of RPM too. Snafu wants to see a Ford 300 inline 6-cylinder versus a Ford 302. I'd like to see the graph layover. I think that the problem there is there's so much aftermarket support for the little 302 V8 compared to the inline 6-cylinder. I think it would be hard to get the 6-cylinder to do what a 302 does without a lot of work. Walmart, you should show how an intake or head can lower boost from a supercharger and make more power. That video is already up. I did that on we ran a Holley or Wyand 174 supercharger and then ran it with all the stock stuff and then did head upgrade and then did a camshaft upgrade. And I also did that with a Kenny Bell where we did a cam upgrade on it. And then I think the heads that we did in that video for the Wyand supercharger, we went from stock E7TE iron heads to, I think, a set of Canfield heads. And it definitely does lower the boost and help make more power. Scott Mason, Richard, you said you're 2000. Mine's actually 1002. Get 20 miles per gallon on the freeway at what average speed? I set the cruise at like 70 going down the 5 freeway. And it gets a little bit better at 65 if you want to drive that speed. But anymore, I drive about 70. Yeah, Julius, I agree. I think that this, what I will say is Tony is easy to talk to and good knowledge. I was happy to talk to this Aussie a few years ago and building a 360 for an Aussie Charger. YouTube drama is good for business. And that's exactly what I was thinking while I was watching that video, because somebody had sent me a thing and said, hey, you need to check this out. Even though it's not directed at me, I like watching his stuff anyway. But the one thing I can say is he's cashing in on people calling him out on this because all of his guys are obviously going to come to his support. So when he mentions this and says, hey, I've solved this problem, or here's another, in the long line of discussions that we're going to have about this topic, then everybody jumps in and watches the video. So it definitely is good for him. Yeah, John, I agree. I'm still a little bit on the fence about the rod ratio thing. And the times that I've tested it on the Chevy motors that we ran it on those old school Chevy motors, it didn't seem to make hardly any difference. But I want to test it on a Ford now and see. And not that I think a Ford is going to do anything different than a Chevy, but I want to try it again, because after coming back from Brian Tooley Racing and testing the 243s and the 862s, I got different results. So, and I'm trying to get that video up. I'm just trying to get the rest of the information from the guys at Brian Tooley Racing. And as soon as I do, I'll be able to put that up. But we did a whole step-by-step deal with 862 heads where we did, stock and did a big valve version and did a chamber version and then did ported version. And, getting them to even match the 243s, which flowed more air than any 243 I've ever seen. But getting that to happen was a really hard thing. And so now I want to know if the test that I did, the multiple tests that I did back in the day, didn't show the whole story. Because I have no vested interest in what happens when I compare a 706 head to a 243 or a 317 or 241 or any of them. I just want to make sure that I provide the accurate data. So if people are talking about it, or more importantly, if people want to try something, they know which direction to go. That's all I care about. I mean, I don't sell any of these. I don't do 706 heads or 243 heads or any of them. I don't sell any of that stuff. And what I was trying to show is that people could make lots of power with the thing that they already had, and that makes a cheaper way to go. But if the other head is worth power, then I got to tell them that too. So that's why I got to do more testing, and I got to do more testing with the rod ratio. But I'm excited about flipping a piston. I just want to see if it will work. There's no factory 347 small block in the States. Those are only available through Ford Racing or from other suppliers. Have you ever lost a rattlesnake in the dining room? No. Although we see walking out of West Tech, especially late at night, because I'm there late at night a lot of times, there's all kinds of wildlife around there. There are coyotes running around, and this is in an industrial area. There's coyotes running around. I see skunks all the time. I walked out, and about a foot away from me was a giant possum, and he just looked up at me like, yeah, what are you going to do? And just kept on his way like I wasn't even there. Didn't even care. There's bushes all around the industrial areas. There's bunnies that come out at night. There's obviously hawks and owls and all kinds. It's like crazy. It's an industrial. And when I was driving down the road and I see 3 coyotes like running off to the side, I'm like, man, this is like it's like out of National Geographic. But I've never seen any snakes down there, at least not near West Tech. Lots of lizards though. Have you ever gotten your hands on a 464 valve FR500C intake before? It was the trumpet split plenum with a single throttle. I think Hovitz had one of those. Is the FR500C the one with is it the magnesium one? Because I have one of those and I've run lots of testing on that. But I don't know about the C. The FR500 manifold that I have is a dual runner magnesium with I don't have the actuators, but it has actuators that open and close the short runner portion of the manifolds, and then it has a removable lid on it, which we ran it in short runner configuration, and then just yanked the lid off of it while I was at wide open throttle to turn it into kind of an IR manifold, and that worked really good. Do you strive for the most airflow through heads with the flow bench? I don't do head porting, so that's not me. But no, you don't. The maximum amount of airflow is not always the thing. You want the maximum amount of power, and whatever you have to do to the head to make that work. Robzilla Garage, what you want on we use seatbelts all the time. So you just attach the seatbelts to one corner, one front corner and one back corner. And if you want to go the other way also and lift it up, you can do that. But as long as you have 2 corners that kind of, and then grab it in the center, and you could tie it around anything. So a lot of new cars have lifting eyes. So they have something actually bolted to the head that has a circle in it, and you just put it through there and tie it a bunch of times to make sure that and make sure that it's something that's not going to cut the seatbelt. Seatbelts are pretty tough. I mean, they're really, really hard to break. So you have to cut them with a knife. So just tie it at each corner, something on each corner, and lift it up. It works good. Philip, the BXR is the one with the remote. Yeah, I tested that years and years ago, and it was pretty cool manifold though. Joyce is talking about the accents in Australia. ProCharge Mopar, did you see that Dulcich asked Tony for his phone number publicly on Instagram? Steve wanted to chat. I think they should. I think that Dulcich and Freiberg are great guys. I think Tony's a great guy. You know, obviously this is all good for when you got it's a little East Coast West Coast thing going. And it was, like I said, this is easily solved. Just if that Richard guy would test it, and then we would all know. Are 90s 5 liters worth rebuilding for mid 300 horsepower? So you're talking about the 5-liter 302. Yeah, that's easy. That's 300 horsepower is no problem at all. Andy, 40 thousandths is not bad. It would be better if if you deck the block or got the piston up where it belongs. But 40 thousandths is not unusual, and it's only 8.3 to 1, so the compression's fairly low. Admiral Holly makes a cross ram for the cathedral port that should theoretically outperform the truck manifold. If you take a look, I have that video up. You can take a look and see exactly what it does compared to the truck manifold. $16 barrels of carburetor. When is the latest LS head? So as soon as I get all the information and put it together. Does a dual quad tunnel ram make much of a difference with a turbo setup over, say, a short runner intake on a 350 small block, or which one would possibly be better? What I can tell you is the one that makes the most power NA will make the most power under boost. So if the motor benefits from the tunnel ram, which a lot of times they do, because the tunnel ram has usually equal runners on a small block Chevy, which a single plane will not. You'll have equal runners. They're a little bit straighter. They're usually a little bit longer, at least longer than the shortest versions of the intake manifold on a single plane. So the tunnel ram usually outperforms the single plane, and then it would do that under boost as well. Kevin, the rocker ratio thing is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I don't know any other way to address that. I think it sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on what the motor wants. Does the motor want more lift? I had this discussion with Brule the other day about whether we found the lift from the camshaft and a smaller rocker ratio versus having more rocker ratio and less valve lift on less cam lift. But I don't know that anybody's done a definitive test on that. And I also don't know that it wouldn't be just like real application specific. I think most of the time they're working on with the rockers is getting the valve train geometry right, which is a kind of a critical thing. Omar, typically race motors work best with small combustion chambers, with big bores, small combustion chambers. And then the reason that they do that is so that they can normally run a flat top piston, which flame travels better with a flat top piston. And then with a smaller chamber, you would soften the chamber, you could run less timing, and all of that's good. William, this is talk about both. This is talk about intake manifolds in general are work the same on an LS as they do on a 5-liter Ford or a small block Chevy or a small block Dodge, a Honda. Doesn't matter what they are. Intake manifold and throttle body bigger is better. That doesn't work for an intake manifold. What are your thoughts on the fuel-injected ITB intakes on 302s? They work good. And the nice thing about an individual throttle body injection is that you can change the stack length on them, which definitely has an effect on the power. I've done that a lot, and it works really good. The one thing I can say about the 302 stuff that I tested is all of the lower manifolds for the ITB, for the downdraft stuff, kind of like Shelby ran those back on the Cobras and stuff. They ran them with Webers, but all the lower manifolds seem to need porting. They were sized, I think, when they originally did the molds for them, seemingly for a really small 289 head port. So they're all very small. And then the turns, especially on the front, I think on the front 2 or front 1 port, the turn from the opening in where it transitions from round and changes shape, that transition is not very good. So porting them was worth a lot of power when we did that. Mackenzie, if the results of my testing show that a dual plane intake actually makes more low speed power than the truck manifold or TBS does. So that should help spool a turbo if you're wanting to spool it down in that area where the dual plane makes more torque. You're talking about how to make a quad 4-barrel setup. I've actually seen tunnel rams with 3 4-barrels on them, and they well, I take that back, not tunnel rams. I saw them on blowers, and so they would make a manifold for the 671, 871, 1071, whatever size blower they were putting it. Usually these were boats, and so they would V out the manifold and then make another plate and make the plate so you could put 3 Dominator carburetors on it, just because if you had 2, having 3 obviously is way better. And then apparently now having 4 is even better. Admiral, I have seen the moonshot stuff on NOS. That was a funny deal. ICT car guy Richard, how many pull-ups can you do? I don't know how many I could do now. I haven't done them in a long time. Aaron, what situations would be a 165 AFR head be a better choice than a larger 190 TFS 11R head on a 302? If you don't care about, I mean, both of them on a mild 302 are probably going to make the same power. I don't think the 165 is going to show much over a 190 11R head, because that's a really good head, and the 165 head is also a really good head. I don't think you could go wrong with either one of those. I think the 190 ultimately would allow you to make more power if that's what you wanted to do. But I don't think that you'll see that. A lot of guys were saying, and guys said this way back in the day, oh, you got to put the 165 head on the 302 and use the 185 on a 351. I'm like, no, you absolutely do not. I've run the 185 on, I don't know, 30 or 40 or 50 5-liter Fords, and it works really, really good. So I know that the 190, the TFS head, works really good on there as well. Both of those are good. You're not going to pick up more low-speed power with the 165, I don't think. My 2011 Chevy Express 4.8 gets 20 miles per gallon highway. That's good. And mine's a 4-wheel drive. I wish it was a 2-wheel drive, but because I drive so much, but it still does okay. Andy, I wants to know if it would be possible to test them over different compression ratios. I would like to do that. The problem is it's very, very involved to do it correctly. Dulcich did it a while back, well, years and years back now, and they just started stacking head gaskets, and that creates another problem, because then you have you're changing the quench, and you're changing. Although the Dodge, probably they did it on a Dodge if I remember right, and the piston was way down in the hole already, so they weren't hurting too much. But I don't think that that's a good way to do it. But then do you do it by taking the motor apart and swapping pistons, or do you do it with a head? Do you do it with a gasket? You're always going to change more than one thing rather than just the static compression. You're changing something else. So how much was this and how much was this? So it's a difficult test. Yes, your 5.9 Cummings definitely gets 20 miles a gallon. Those are good. Mike says his 306 made 330 wheel horsepower, which is a lot, with the trick flow track heat, tiny 170cc intake ports. Daniel, I don't know how to make horsepower on a North Star Cadillac. We've only ever run them on the chassis dyno, and it was always the guys at West Tech doing all the tuning over there. John Price wants to know, why do engine builders always try to steer you away from hydraulic rollers on big small blocks of like 430 cubic inch stuff? I think that the reason they're doing that is if you're going to be running lots of power with them, a solid roller is generally better for that application. It's just more repeatable. A lot of times it's hard to get the hydraulic stuff to keep doing the same thing, especially as RPM goes up, they become more and more problematic. Brule is not a fan of those, especially for big blocks. He likes solid roller stuff, because then he doesn't have to worry about it. And the solid roller is lighter too, so that's kind of beneficial. Mustang Crazy is installing the 262 AH cams on a 5.4 4-valve twin turbo. Should I install the cams straight up? Yes, you should install them straight up. You should make sure that you degree them so that they're both the same. And I'm more concerned that they're the same on both sides, that they're installed in the same position on both sides, because we've run across that before where they are not. With CA gas, what air fuel number should I target? 12. I don't know. I don't use a gas analyzer. Are you talking about with California gas, what air fuel number should I target? Okay, maybe I'm understanding that. I thought you were talking about a different kind of gas analyzer. Is this an NA motor? If it's NA, we normally run those in the mid 12s or so, and at 12 to 1 or 12.5 to 1, depending on where they make power and how sensitive they are. If we go from 12.0 to 13.0 and it shows no change in power, we'll run it at 12.0 just because it will be safer. Tony wants to know, intake runner length is directly relative to torque production. How does the 8-stack fuel injection systems on the market today make streetable torque? Because an 8-stack typically has long runners, and if you measure the runner length of a cross ram or a downdraft, they're fairly long. That's why they do fairly well in the torque production. And if you look at, a good example of that are the old big block Crowder and Hilborn stuff that they ran in the Can-Am cars. They were really long, which is why they had good average power production. John, we've only used the Pertronix flamethrower stuff a couple